Every director can look at a trombone player or a saxophone or a clarinet and say, that's not set up correctly. That's not right. But when it comes to drum set, a lot of us are very uncomfortable with it, and then we just kind of don't ever look at it or don't think about it. So then you have kids playing drum set up completely incorrect and completely uncomfortable for them to play because you just don't know. One important thing you need is a rug. I really stress this because that is very crucial to your drum setup. It keeps everything where it needs to be. If you imagine playing a trumpet, the main tuning slide, every time you play it and you have to keep grabbing it and putting it back in during the concert, and you keep going, that gets really stressful. And especially when it comes to drum set, your percussionists don't get to play drum set for every single thing. And sometimes, if you have two or three drummers, they may only get to play drum set for one song every concert. And if the bass drum keeps moving forward because you didn't put a rug under it, it really sucks. Pretty much got to have a terrible performance, and it's not really their fault. So make sure you have a rug for gigs. The other thing I really stress is do not over tighten your hardware. This is something I would do when I was younger because I thought the tighter I could get it, the better. And I would tighten it so much that I would actually have to take two drumsticks, and you do this little trick where you put the two drumsticks together around the wing nut, and you have to actually like bend it to get it to loosen because it's on so tight. What happens is it actually strips out the wing nut from the stand, and it's unusable, so your stand can't like hold where it needs to be. Or I've actually had an old stand that was really heavy duty, and I put so much pressure on it that it actually, the whole part that goes around the main part of the stand actually ripped off. It broke, the metal ripped because I just over tightened. So you really want to teach your students to not over tighten. Make sure that they just get things snug to where they're going to be firm, but not overdo it. And I stress that because you are probably going to be using the same drum set for a very, very long time in your program. To save that drum set and not have it ruined after a few years of use, you really need to make sure your kids are taking good care of it. Drum setup really starts with your throne, the seat. There are some drummers who say your knee or your leg versus where your knee is and everything should be at a 90-degree angle. I think that that's a little uncomfortable for some people, especially taller people. They can be a little bit higher. The main thing I would say is if you see a kid where his knees are higher than his waist, if he's sitting and his knees are like way up there, correct that. You need to tell him to raise the seat up. That's too low, and there is no way they're going to play effectively. First, you have your bass drum. Got to make sure the pedal is on there securely. For some reason, sometimes kids don't connect the pedal to the bass drum, and that just causes a lot of problems. Your hi-hat should be at like a 45-degree angle. It should be comfortable. Just however you place your legs when you just sit on a chair, it should be about that. It should be comfy. I, for some reason, see all the time students who they will have their hi-hat, they'll have their bass drum sticking straight forward, and then their hi-hat pedal will be at a total 90-degree angle. I don't know how in the world you make that comfortable, because they either will have their foot sideways on the pedal like this, or they will have it like they'll bend their leg all the way to the side, so they got this really weird sort of position that they're sitting, and it's not comfortable. And a lot of times the reason they do that is because they have the hi-hat completely closed. Having a closed hi-hat all the time is just essentially, you're never going to learn how to be a good drummer if you don't utilize that hi-hat. The hi-hat is the most important part of your drum set. That is one thing you really need to correct. And a lot of times people aren't going to see that because you only see the drum set from one angle, usually from the outside. So if all you ever see is that drum set from an angle, you maybe can't tell if the bass drum foot is placed right on the pedal or if the hi-hat is correct. So you want to make sure to go behind the drum set, make sure you're checking out what they're doing, look down at their foot. Drummers only get corrected on their hands, and the feet are one of the most important parts of being a drum set player. Also the hi-hat, there should be some height there. It doesn't have to be huge. I would say an inch at the least. I keep mine pretty high, but it's up to the player. But as long as they need to have some sort of give in there because they need to be using that hi-hat the right way. So then you move on to your snare drum and your floor tom. The snare drum and floor tom should be pretty even. It should be at a comfortable height for them. I will say if the snare drum is too low and it looks like they're reaching like between their legs to play it, that's too low. If you always hear them hitting the rim on accident, that's too high. Sometimes they place it sort of on the side of the bass drum. They have this weird like flat setup where it's like hi-hat, snare, bass drum, floor tom. And then when they're playing, they're doing this very uncomfortable reaching. It causes them to be really inaccurate with how they're playing. You want to bring that snare in. It should like hug right in between your legs. And then your floor tom should just kind of come right up next to the side of your right leg. Now the high toms, I'm gonna say I highly suggest getting rid of the second high tom. The only thing that kids want to do, especially in middle school, they want to play that fill. A lot of times, if you have one of those old rock drum sets where the toms are like super deep for no reason, you can't get them placed in a comfortable position for a smaller kid, so they end up having these toms that are like way up above their head, or they have to twist them down so that they bend the drums to the side. One head's going this way, one head's going this way, and they have to play like this, and it's really uncomfortable. I can't get these toms any closer together, partly because the bass drum's too high, and for a kid, they can't have the toms up here. It's too high for them. It's even high for me. The other thing I don't like is that this tom, since I can't move it, it is really far. So when I play, my arm is fully extended. This arm is fully extended. And it's not comfortable. If they do this fill and then they try to come back, they're reaching very far. And so here I'm reaching, here I'm like bringing my arms in. And it's all very uncomfortable to play. And for a young kid who doesn't know, he probably doesn't realize that it's uncomfortable. To him, it's just, this is how you put it together and that's what you do. So I really recommend getting rid of this tom because it's not comfortable. Plus, they will start to play something maybe a little more tasteful. They can play instead of just everything being. I'm going to talk about mounting your tom. I really hate these. This is by Tama. Yamaha makes them. They are not bad products. The thing is, I just get really frustrated because in a school setting, they are not good. They have these little balls in them, and the idea is that you can take them apart, or you can loosen them, and then you can adjust them to any direction you want, and it's really easy. The only problem with that is that when you're dealing with kids and they don't care, they sit there and they bend them and they mess with them, and to the point where now you put two really heavy toms on them and they can't support the weight because they're worn out. And I see that in drum sets that people buy within a year, they're worn out because kids didn't take care of them. That's one thing I really don't like about these for a school setting. So there's a wing nut there that you use to separate these two sides. And what has happened on this one is that kids have jacked with it and pushed it around to the point where now it is stuck and I can't loosen it because this wing nut can't move. That's why I like to use the John Bonham method, which is to use a snare stand for your high tom. If you have a drum like this that has this mounting system, that's okay. Get a snare drum stand, a heavy duty one, and take one of the toms off and put it on that stand. I recommend that. Your kids are not going to jack with it. The tom is not going to move around while they're supposed to be playing. It's just going to be a better experience for everybody. 90% of their playing is done, at least in jazz, on the ride cymbal. If you put that tom there and you have to put your ride cymbal somewhere really uncomfortable, that means 90% of the time what they're playing is super uncomfortable anyway. I really suggest getting rid of that second tom, putting your just one high tom right there. I'll be doing a video on good drum sets for like middle school students, and I'll try to link that below whenever I have that done. If you are going to have multiple toms, though, I will say they have to be even. You can't have it as two different faces or them like split apart. They need to be one right next to another. They need to be flat. So if you have toms that are short enough that work, great. If you don't, you really need to get rid of that tom. So then the last thing you put on your kit would be your cymbals. Crash cymbals, I usually leave those flat. I know some people will say have them like angled down a bit. I just don't think you get a very accurate sound when they're angled down, and a lot of kids end up hitting it with the tip of their stick, which is not the sound of a crash cymbal you want. Personally, I keep those pretty high. That is strictly for show. When I was in college, they would always tell you, get your cymbals as low, make everything as low as possible so everything's right here and you're not like reaching around to play. Totally agree with that. The only reason I do that is because when I'm moving my arms, the audience seems to love that a little more because I look more interactive. But I will say from an educational standpoint, get the crash cymbals low. The ride cymbal should be slightly tilted, just enough that their stick hits it. If it's completely flat, they'll be hitting it with the edge of their stick, and that's not the sound you want. You want the tip of the stick. And then the hi-hat should be a comfortable distance between the snare drum rim. When I was starting out, I had a teacher who was a rock guy, so his hi-hat was like up here. My snare drum was way low, so I was playing like this. I've definitely lowered that since, especially now that I play jazz. I don't really play the hi-hat all that much. just straight ahead. Probably say 6 inches, you know, nothing too crazy. Try to make sure your students aren't raising that hi-hat like up to their ear and playing up here. It's not comfortable. One thing I really want you to think about as a director, and my directors always acted like I was really crazy for this. They acted like, oh, you think you get to run the band room, and that's not what it is. But you have to think about this from like my standpoint, okay? The drum set is like a community instrument. When concert band comes around, they rip that drum set apart, they take everything off of it, and all of a sudden the ride cymbal is a suspended cymbal, the hi-hat is being used, toms are being taken apart so they can use them for like a timpani part or something. When everybody tears that thing apart, that kid has to reassemble that whole drum set for rehearsal. And it's hard because you can reassemble it and it can still feel very uncomfortable. Plenty of saxophone players, they will complain about just the slightest little adjustment. And yet they totally understand that, but then when a drummer says like, everybody mess with the drum set, and you go, oh, come on, it's fine. No, it's not fine. It's really frustrating. One day you can play really well, and then the next day you come up, the drum set's totally jacked up and messed up, and you're just, it doesn't feel right, and it screws you up. Not everybody can afford to have enough equipment to have a full drum set that is just by itself and then everything. But I want you to think about that. That is one thing I hear every band director say, like, it doesn't matter. You know, whatever, they can deal with it. Just remember, if you had to readjust your saxophone keys every single time you played it, because every time concert band came around, people took keys off your instrument and you had to reassemble it, you would get very frustrated very quickly. And I just want you to understand that's how percussionists, or how a drum set player feels. What I'm attempting to do is give you a really generalized idea of how to get an effective drum setup. I've seen people who, they come from a college with a really great drummer as a director, and they set up their drum set really weird. It works for them, but then this director comes around and he's teaching all his students, yeah, put the ride cymbal flat right here, and then you can play it like this. I want you to have this here, your crash cymbal's flat. Get it? I get it, because you've seen someone who's really good use it, and they will tell you, no, this is the right way to do it. I mean, I know because it works for me. But when you're teaching in an educational place, it's sort of like if every single kid playing trumpet, you told them to play like Dizzy Gillespie. He's a great player, we all have respect for him, but we still don't tell kids to puff out their cheeks, bend their trumpet bell up. It's the same idea. Understand that there's lots of weird ways to set up a drum set, but this is the effective way to help them, especially if you have 2 or 3 kids playing on a drum set. One really wacky setup may work for one kid, but the rest of them may be really uncomfortable. Standardize it, make it so it works for everybody, at least as well as possible. I'm not really a big gear person. I don't really harp on buying the most expensive of anything, but the next video is going to be about the type of gear you have, the size of sticks, cymbals, the type of things your kids are using that is really causing them not to play well on drum set, because there is a big difference between concert sticks and jazz sticks, suspended cymbal, and like a jazz ride. There's a big difference.